What is happening, guys? Nick Boletto here, back with another video. In today's video, we are covering the fourth principle in the Foundations of Strength Training series. We are going to be talking about exercise, variation, and selection. It is one of my favorite of all of the foundations. I think it's the most interesting, although it's nowhere near the most important. I think that it is the one foundation that you can really separate a good training program from a great training program. So let's get into it. With exercise variation and selection, there are going to be three main goals. Goal number one is to prevent injury. Goal number two is to prevent staleness. And goal number three is to enhance the adaptive responses to long-term training over time. So actually improving our performance. Now, before we actually get into talking about exercise variation itself, I do want to make something extremely clear, and that is that specificity is the most important of the foundations of strength training. And so, generally speaking, we want the majority of our training to be very specific to our goals. So in the case of a powerlifter, you should be doing the competition squat the majority of your training. However, if you only do the competition squat, that's going to lead to potentially injury, and it will definitely lead to staleness. So that's where exercise variation comes in handy, is that we are able to kind of prevent that staleness and the possibility of injuring ourselves by only doing the competition lift. Furthermore, if we don't eventually introduce exercise variation, our other option becomes, well, we can just continue to grind out competition lifts. And when we talked about specificity, we talked about the Bulgarian weightlifting team, and we saw how powerful specificity can be. I mean, it was common for those guys to put 50 kilos onto their front squats in the first couple of months being a part of the program. However, after that, they saw that their strength gains were slowed down extremely. And you could argue that maybe if they had just introduced some sort of variation, whether it was variations in the actual movement itself or just variations in reps and sets, they might have been able to make insane gains over the long term instead of just really, really great gains in the short term when they immediately joined the program. So how do we actually go about choosing variation? In my experience, in my opinion, there are really two criteria that you want to consider when you're choosing a variation. The first is to address technical efficiency. So there's some sort of breakdown in the lift, in a specific lift that you want to address, and there are lifts to address that specific weakness. So an example of this is if you're a sumo deadlifter and as soon as you start to pull the bar off the floor, your hips shoot up. So you may do a cycle where you're doing just pulls to the knee. That's a common variation that I'll use with sumo deadlifters. And that is literally what it sounds like. You're just deadlifting up to your knee, and that's addressing a technical proficiency. The second reason to choose a variation is to address a muscular imbalance, or to specifically target a specific muscle to grow that muscle. So an example of this is you may have a lifter who is stalling out on his progress on the bench press, and just in looking at his physique, you can see that he has a well-developed chest. In that case, you would then look possibly to his arms, see that his arms are lagging a little bit behind in their development, and so for a cycle or two, you may do close grip bench press with the goal of building up his triceps. So what about movements that aren't squat, bench, and deadlift? How do we choose exercises, and how do we choose variations of exercises for our accessory work? There are three criteria that I follow when I'm choosing exercises for bodybuilding purposes or just for accessory purposes for powerlifters. And I won't take credit for developing these three criteria. These three come from Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach. I would strongly recommend that you follow him on Instagram. He puts out some of the most informative and insightful content that I've seen on that app, period. So again, strongly recommend that you follow him, but I'm going to jump into those three principles and explain them the best that I can. So those three principles are alignment, bracing, and profile. So alignment refers to how well the load, the force that is applied by the load, aligns with the force that is being applied by our muscles. So we typically want our muscles, the muscles that we're targeting in a movement, to be projecting a force that's perpendicular to the force that's being applied by whatever weight that we're lifting. So an easy way to think about this, and an example that I actually used in the gym the other day, was somebody was asking me about targeting kind of like the teardrop on the quad. And he was asking me, well, if I turn my toes out, will I be able to target the teardrop on my quad? So I just broke it down to him in a really simple physics equation. So the weight, the force that's due to gravity is just the weight, and that is directly perpendicular with the ground. And so essentially whatever force is being applied directly parallel to that force that's due to the weight is where the tension is going to be. So yes, if we externally rotate our legs out so that the teardrop is kind of on top, that is what's going to be using the weight a lot more. Principle number 2 is bracing, and bracing refers to how well we're able to stabilize and or completely lock down a particular muscle in order to better target the muscle that we're trying to use. So that might sound a little strange and hard to understand, but an example of this is in our leg training, we often want to stabilize the muscles of the pelvic floor. So if we're doing a leg press, for example, and our pelvis is rotating, it's really hard to get tension on our quads. However, if we're able to lock ourselves down and stabilize our pelvis by contracting the muscles of our pelvic floor and kind of using our adductors and our core to kind of hold everything in position, we're able to keep the tension on our quads. Another example of this is when we're doing a triceps push down, for example. If we don't stabilize our scapula in the back, then what will often happen is the load will move onto our rear delts and the muscles of our upper back, and it takes the tension off our triceps. So if we're trying to build our quads or we're trying to build our triceps and we're not stabilizing those joints, then the bracing is not good, and that's not an exercise that we want to use. So there's a couple of options. We either need to learn how to stabilize those joints or those muscles, whatever it may be, and that is the route that I would suggest taking. However, you may also want to just choose different exercises. There are individual differences that we have to take into play, and there are some exercises that some people just aren't capable of executing properly. Profile is the last of the criteria, and profile refers to how well the loading matches up with the strength curve of a muscle. So typically speaking, a muscle is able to produce the most force when it's lengthened, because the longer the lever is that the muscle has to work through, the more work that it has to do, because work is just force times the length times distance. So if we can increase the distance, then the force is going to be working over a longer distance. More work done will lead to more hypertrophy. So we want to do movements that are going to train the lengthened portion as often as possible in order to stimulate the most hypertrophy. So an example of a movement that has a good muscle building profile is doing an incline biceps curl versus just a standing biceps curl, where a standing biceps curl is hardest during the mid-range of the movement, where the biceps is already shortened to a degree. When we lay on an incline bench, the movement is hardest right from the beginning when the biceps is in a lengthened state. So while you won't be able to use as much load, it's much more mechanically challenging for the biceps. And mechanical tension, we know, is the #1 driver of hypertrophy. So we want to create as much mechanical tension as possible, and that's why you want to train muscles in a lengthened state. Anyways, guys, that is the principle of exercise variation and selection in a nutshell. We want to choose exercise variations to prevent injury and staleness, and also just create better long-term training effects overall. We need some sort of novel stimulus from time to time. We can't just always do the competition squat, bench, and deadlift. And then when we're choosing accessory exercises, we want to focus on the alignment, the bracing, and the profile of the exercise. That will make the exercise not only the most effective and worthwhile for us, but it will also make it the safest for us. It'll put the tension on the muscles that we're trying to train, and it'll take it off of the joints. So keeping us injury-free and also producing the greatest long-term training effects is why variation is so important, and that's why I made it principle number 4 in the foundations of strength training. If you guys like this video, make sure to give the video a thumbs up, comment with any questions below. Like I said, this is my favorite of all of the principles of strength training, so I would love to have a conversation about any questions that you may have. This is also the one that I take the most pride in my coaching. If you guys are interested in my coaching services, I have a link in the description box. I would love to have a chat with you about what we could do together. And I appreciate you guys checking out this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.